Labels are interesting things. I think people are seeking to assign meaning to their lives through identity. And I think people find their identity through labels, through the labeling of themselves. The way I see it is there are two kinds of labels. Some of the labels can be in the gray area in between, but most fall in one of two camps. So labels are either selfish, meaning they relate to the self, or they are relational in that they relate to others. So for instance, relational labels would be mother, husband, child, grandmother, etc. Labels which relate to the self describe us and who we are, whereas the other labels describe our relationships with others. So labels that are more selfish, or labels that are more inherently selfish, are labels of profession. I'm an engineer. They could be labels of type. I'm an INFJ. They could be labels of skills and abilities. I'm an artist. I'm an empath. They are descriptive of who you are rather than your relationship with others. And I realize some can cross over, such as a teacher. That's a label. It describes who you are. And it's a profession, but it's also relational because it's how you relate to your students. But for the most part, I think labels are either one or the other. And this is how I see labels. There are two kinds in our lives. I find it interesting when we're little children, we don't seem to place as many labels on ourselves. Life is very simple. We are who we are. For the most part, our label is our name. Someone says, "Who are you?" I am, and then you give your name. You more identify with your name as to who you are. You don't hear many 8-year-olds saying, "I'm an empath." As we go through life, I think we're seeking to assign meaning to our lives through identity. We struggle with who am I, and that's when the search for labeling begins. Part of the struggle for some of us is that as we go through the world, we start to feel more and more alone. We have bad experiences with people. We lose our innocence and start seeing the world as it really is. People can't be trusted. They let us down. We make mistakes. We let ourselves down. We feel isolated from others in a sense that we're not understood, or maybe we can't understand ourselves, and we feel separated from humanity. And I think the labels are an attempt to make us not feel so alone. People choose labels and put labels on themselves so they can have a sense of community, a sense of belonging with other people. You might say, for instance, since this is a mostly typology channel, I'm an INFJ. And people hold on to that label because it gives them what they think is a sense of belonging. I belong to this INFJ community now. I'm a part of this thing. And as human beings, we're all seeking to be unique. We're all trying to find our way in life. But this becomes a problem when we are seeking to assign meaning to our lives through identity, but don't realize that identity in itself is not going to give you meaning. It's what you do with that identity. It's the purpose it gives you in life. And when you put this label on yourself, for instance, the INFJ label, it's not enough to have that label on yourself. And sadly, I think that's where most people stop. I'm this thing, I'm this INFJ. And they're not looking to see what they're supposed to do with the label. And it's the purpose in it that makes the label meaningful. And I think when you start doing that, when you start seeking purpose, ironically, the label itself becomes less important. It's more about the purpose than the actual label. And this is where things become a big circle jerk because people get stuck in a label. And again, ironically, you start out with this label because you want to have this sense of community, this sense of belonging. But the more you start putting all these labels on yourself, the more you start piling them all on, the more separate you end up feeling, because now what you've done is you've made yourself into some kind of, and I don't like using this terminology, but it fits, you made yourself into some kind of special snowflake. No one else is like me. I'm an INFJ. I'm an empath. I'm this. I'm that. And you put all these labels on yourself. And now what started out as a way to belong has actually separated you or isolated you even further. It's alienated you. Labels are about identity. And if you don't think labels aren't about identity, just start looking around. People who have an illness or a chronic disease, they seek to assign meaning in their lives through that illness. You'll meet someone and they'll say, I have fibromyalgia, or I'm a diabetic, and they identify themselves with this. They identify with their sickness. I have cancer, or whatever. There are whole groups out there solely dedicated to chronic diseases or illnesses. And it's not just illnesses, it's many other things as well. And I understand it. Initially, it's about support. And I get that. We all do this, right? I think people have good intentions when they start labeling themselves, because really they're seeking to find meaning in life. They want to find a purpose. Or they're seeking to understand themselves by playing around with labels. But at some point, it has to move beyond that. It just can't sit there. It's the purpose, like I said. It's what you do with the label, which gives it meaning. In some cases, identifying with a label is so extreme. I've heard many cases of people who died as soon as they retired from their profession. And I believe it's because they had found their identity not in part, but almost in full with that profession. So when it's no longer in their lives, they don't know what to do anymore. It causes death for them because they identified with that thing so strongly that they don't know who they are without that thing, and they can't survive without it. I've had times like that in my life too, where I've changed jobs or whatever, and I think, well, who am I? I've been this thing for so many years now. What am I now? It's almost like it causes an identity crisis. Think about professions. People give themselves these labels based on what they do. That's one of the first questions you get asked when you meet someone. What do you do? Because we have such a strong identity with our profession. Gender wars. How many people are seeking to give themselves titles? I'm this, I'm that, I'm not a he or she, but I'm this thing. They want identity in it. They want to create their own label for themselves. Labels are extremely important in our lives. People just want to label themselves, and they spend their entire lives labeling themselves. But just labeling yourself is not helpful in and of itself. It's what you do with the labels. We have to label ourselves. I'm not advocating not giving ourselves labels, but we identify with some of them so strongly, we just don't know what to do when they don't exist anymore. Many years ago, I knew of a music teacher who tragically lost both of her teenage sons within 1 year of each other. She was a mother one day, and then she was no longer a mother. And I remember when I heard about it, it affected me profoundly, and I thought about it for a long time. This woman had 2 children, and then she had none. What did that do to her? She had been a mother all those years, and it was taken away from her so that she was no longer a mother. What did she have to go through to let go of that label? To wake up and realize she was no longer a mother. And that's what happens when people lose loved ones in life. I'm no longer a wife, or I'm no longer a husband, or I'm no longer a child of someone. Basically, I'm an orphan now. I've lost my parents. I'm no longer someone's child. And this is why grief can also become an identity crisis if we have so strongly associated ourselves with another in such a way. We need to learn lessons from our labels. I see it like this. Labels are not restrictive, they are fluid. So when I was born immediately with the label of daughter. I had 2 parents, and I wore that label for decades. And one day my parents were gone, and I was no longer a daughter. It's not like I can wear that label anymore, but it's not about the label, right? It's about the purpose in it. So what did I learn from that label? The lessons I learned from that label were invaluable. The label was temporary, but it wasn't about the label. It was about the purpose in it and how I can now relate to other people who say they are daughters or who have parents or whatever. People say typing puts me in a box, and that's why they reject it. But it's not like that. It's a label like everything else. It's just something you wear in your life. Again, the daughter label. How that label looked on me when I was born as opposed to how it looked 30 years later was very different. How I looked as a daughter at 5 years old is not the same as how I look as a daughter at 35. It's not restrictive. Your relationship with your parents as you go through life is going to change. It's not going to look the same in every year that you wear that label. And as you go through life, you pick up other labels, and that's how it works. So you decide to become a teacher. Well, how you look as a teacher in your first year is not how you're going to look as a teacher 20 years later. You take everything you've learned from these labels with you throughout your life. So as a teacher, when you end your journey as a teacher, you never really stop being a teacher. You might no longer be a teacher in the practical application, but you are always really a teacher because it's a skill you acquired. I think about that woman who was a mother. Just because she lost her sons, yes, she was no longer a mother in the practical application. But what did she learn when she was a mother? What kind of lessons did she learn that she could take throughout her life, even to help other mothers? So I don't think any of these labels or types define you fully as much as they shape you. They shape you into who you are or what you're meant to be. And I believe all these labels we wear in life are all part of our journey to become who we were meant to be. And that's what makes you unique, I have labels, many labels I've worn through my life. That's made me who I am. But I don't necessarily go around saying, I'm a daughter, I'm a teacher, I'm a musician, I'm a needleworker, I'm a YouTuber, or, whatever it is you want to say. I don't put those labels on a t-shirt and wear them around all the time like I see other people doing. It's not about the labels. It's what I end up doing with all of them collectively. All the lessons they have to teach me. And that's my goal in life, to become the best person I can be. And there's a greater purpose in that desire. And all those labels, how you end up fulfilling them later in life should be greatly expanded. I said that earlier, but where you end up in the label is a lot more developed than how you began. Like type. You're born with a certain type. You don't become one, nor can you change into another one somewhere down the road. You're born with your type. But how you end up fulfilling that type later in life should be greatly expanded. You should get way beyond the basics into a mature version of that type. Labels can also be divisive. And you know this if you're listening to these words. You just try going to a family reunion and walking in and saying, I'm a Republican or I'm a Democrat. And you'll see the reaction that you get. And it's because I have this understanding of how labels can be divisive that I kind of shy away from identifying with a label when I meet new people or am in a new situation. I wouldn't go into a situation and drop a label immediately. I'm this or I'm that, because I know labels automatically separate you from people. And unfortunately, when people hear a label, they automatically make a judgment. I say unfortunately, but really that's just human nature. So if someone says, I'm a Republican, then people are automatically going to see you in a certain light. They're going to say, well, you support the president, when maybe you don't. Or someone will say, I'm a Democrat, and someone will say, well, you support, fill in whatever policy here, but you don't really support that policy. But people are going to make assumptions about labels. And again, the assumptions might not be correct, but people make a whole lot of judgments. And that's the very reason why I choose not to identify myself by labels right away, and especially with people that I don't know. Labels can cause division, but in a strange way, they also can cause belonging at the same time. And I think that's the attraction with labels. Some people relish in being inflammatory, and in a strange way, they find belonging in that, whereas others relish in being relatable to others, and they find belonging in that. Of course, it's unavoidable that we have labels in our lives. It's kind of a talking point, right? Sometimes it's a good place to start. It's where you can sort of meet people where they are. Sometimes it's a way to quickly get somewhere. But, realize that that's kind of idealistic because judgments will be made. It's just the way of human nature. I'd love to say, when I'm speaking with someone in conversation and they give themselves a label, I'd love to say that I don't automatically jump to conclusions. But of course, I'm a human being as well, and I do these things. But I think that we have to be very careful when hearing labels not to make assumptions or not to stereotype people in such a way. Labels are a problem when they're used to limit your actual experience of a person, or when they're used to define someone or stereotype them. And we are all guilty of this. We do this to others as well as do it to ourselves. We judge other people's labels and we assume we know what that label means to them. We base what someone says a label is from what someone else says the label is, and it might not be the same thing exactly. In other words, we compare two things, but we don't realize we aren't comparing the same two things. Instead, we should ask someone, what do you mean by that label? Someone says, I'm an artist. You should say, well, what do you mean by I'm an artist? Or what do you mean by artist? It could mean a whole lot of different things. But if we meet someone who's an artist, whose art is photography, and then later we meet someone else who says they're an artist and we assume they're a photographer, that's not correct. So it's best to ask questions. Personally, I'm very careful when I get into groups of people that I don't know, that I don't toss a label out there to define myself because I know what people do with it. So in some ways, I'm trying to make for an easier interaction. I know I can't control people fully because people will judge you before you even open your mouth, based on things like what you wear, how you hold yourself, who you showed up with, etc. But I'm trying to make it a little easier by not putting these labels on myself so people don't automatically assume things about me. I help them stay a little bit open-minded if they can. And I'm trying to give them the opportunity to be more open-minded, and I'm also trying to give myself that chance as well. That's why when you ask questions of the other person, if they choose to put labels on themselves, like, what do you mean by this? It's a good thing to do that. And sometimes you can't avoid a label. You have to wear it. But realize when you put labels out there, other people will automatically make assumptions and judge you. And we should be very careful not to do that to others. And we still will. We're still going to do it, but at least recognize when you've done it. I found labels of lifestyle tend to be very problematic in the sense that people very strongly connect with these labels, whether it's sexual orientation, gender, type, religion, etc., how they choose to live their lives. These are the ones that people really hold on hard to. It becomes such a fabric of their being that they identify so strongly with the label. And I understand that. And I'm not necessarily condemning it, but you can tell, when you challenge that label, what comes out of a person. And a lot of times you're met with anger, like, how dare you say who you think I am? Because people want to think they know themselves better than anyone else can. And that's not always true. I could not have said that about myself years ago. I couldn't have said that I know myself better than someone else could know me. Yes, some people are more self-aware than others. This is true, but generally as humans, we all tend to think no one knows me like I know myself. And while that is true on some levels, it's false on some other ones, right? We all have our blind spots. We all have blockages to certain parts of ourselves that we refuse to see because we don't want to deal with it, or maybe we don't have the tools to deal with it. So when someone comes along and challenges the label, they're met with, how dare you? You don't know me. And that's not always true, but people don't appreciate having their label challenged. So those identity labels are the ones that really stick with people. And if you're going to challenge them, then good luck to you. You better suit up in your armor because you're going to get fiery darts thrown at you. And I find it's the identity labels which really get challenged the most, not so much the relational labels. Which brings me to my final point. I was thinking about cemeteries. And I've said this before in another video I made about cemeteries, but I love visiting them. It kind of strips everything down in life. It puts everything in perspective for me. All of us tend to think we are immortal beings. We go through life, and it's not that we don't think about death, but we really think it's not going to happen to us. So it's interesting to walk through cemeteries, which are a record of life. And when you visit a cemetery, it makes you really think about labels. You could sit down and you can write all the labels you've worn in your life. Personally, I could probably think of at least 20. I can make a list of 20 labels I've worn. But when people leave this earth, which labels do they choose to put on their tombstone? You have to really strip down at that point. You have to think about which labels mean the most out of all the ones you've worn in your life. You can't put many on your tombstone, right? It's not like you can put your 20 labels on the back of your tombstone. So this is the lesson. Why go around in life wearing 20 plus labels on your shirt for all the world to see when you die, you get stripped down to the ones which matter most? You aren't going to put those 20 labels on your tombstone. So why should you wear them so boldly now in this life? So it's kind of interesting to see which labels people choose. If you study tombstones, all the labels you see are simple and they're relational. They're not the ones of personal identity. If you look at tombstones, what do you see? Mother, father, wife of, husband of. They're all relational. I've been to some very old cemeteries. I was just at one recently, which has tombstones from the 1700s, and there are also tombstones from people who've died as recently as this year. But nothing changes. I don't see INFJ on someone's tombstone. I don't see engineer. I mean, you don't see professions generally on people's tombstones. You don't see sicknesses. You don't see gender. You don't even see Mr. or Mrs. It's all stripped down to the basics. It goes back to the names, the dates, and the relational, the simple relational labels. And I think that when we're standing at death's door, all the other labels don't seem to matter anymore. I think what we want to be remembered for most is our relationships with others. And that's the point of all these labels, right? We are seeking to find our place in this world. We are seeking to understand ourselves. We are seeking to understand how we relate to others. How do I relate to others? What's my place in this world? And I think at the end, it just shows you it's about what you've given to others or what difference you've made in the lives of someone else. What have you done for others? How have you joined your piece of the puzzle with others in such a way? And I think that the labels that we wear are just a way to get there. And it seems that at the end of life, the relational labels are the ones which seem to matter the most. That's how people find purpose. It's through relationships. And I think that's what labels teach us ultimately. I think that's what has the most impact in our lives. It's the relationships and what we do with them.